Good evening. This is the A Course in Miracles Palm Beach Study Group. Today is Thursday, June 17, 2021. We will start with a moment of silence. Thank you. We're on Chapter 4, Section 2, the Ego and False Autonomy. It is reasonable to ask how the mind could ever have made the ego. In fact, it is the best question you could ask. There is, however, no point in giving an answer in terms of the past because the past does not matter, and history would not exist if the same errors were not being repeated in the present. Abstract thought applies to knowledge because knowledge is completely impersonal, and examples are irrelevant to its understanding. Perception, however, is always specific and therefore quite concrete. Everyone makes an ego or a self for himself, which is subject to enormous variation because of its instability. He also makes an ego for everyone else he perceives, which is equally variable. Their interaction is a process that alters both, because they were not made by or with the unalterable. It is important to realize that this alteration can and does occur as readily when the interaction takes place in the mind as when it involves physical proximity. Thinking about another ego is as effective in changing relative perception as is physical interaction. There could be no better example than the ego is only an idea and not a fact. Questions? Comments? Well, Helene?
Well,
I'm afraid. Oh, go ahead, Eileen.
No, I was just going to say I need a minute to digest, so it's perfect for you to talk, Helene.
Yeah, no, I need a lot more than a minute to digest this. I was lost from the first paragraph when the suggestion was made that history would not exist if the same errors were not being repeated in the present. I guess I started thinking about that, wondering, I mean, history is always going to exist, right? Whether or not there are errors in the present, because history is simply a recounting of what occurred already.
Yes, but time is not real.
Ah, there we go. There's the trick. Okay, thanks, John.
Time is an ego construct. In spirit, there is no time. It's eternity. It's always.
So the error of thinking there's time is what keeps being repeated. Basically, the error of that was being repeated is that we keep thinking there's such a thing as time.
Well,
is
that's
that what you're
part of
saying?
it. That's part of it, yeah. Am I getting an echo? No? Okay.
I hear you, okay.
All righty, let's go back again. Let's take it. It is reasonable to ask how the mind could have ever made the ego. because we're being told that we created the ego, that was our thought. And that's how all of this started, this separation, thought of separation started in our mind, and that created the ego. So he's saying it's only reasonable to ask. In fact, it is the best question you could ask. Why? Well, because so that you have a better understanding of who you are and what you did. There is, however, no point in giving an answer in terms of the past, saying, well, 500 million years ago, so-and-so did such and such, and because the past doesn't matter, and history would not exist if the same errors were not being repeated in the present, because that's all time. Ego started time. Time doesn't exist in the world of spirit. Spiritual time is now, eternal nowness. So it doesn't really matter. Abstract thought applies to knowledge. Now, knowledge is of spirit, because knowledge is of truth. Because knowledge is completely impersonal. It doesn't depend on ego personalities. And examples are irrelevant to its understanding. Understanding, again, is spirit. Understanding and knowledge is spirit. Perception, however, perception is of ego, is always specific and therefore quite concrete, because the ego wants to make you believe that itself is real. So everyone makes an ego or a self for himself, which is subject to enormous variation because of its instability. The spirit is knowledge and understanding. It is truth. It is, it always has been, it always will be. But perception, ego thinking, is very unstable and have lots of variations on the one hand. However, it can be quite specific and quite concrete to those who are thinking in ego, to those who are perceiving. He also makes an ego for everyone else he perceives, or you. You always make an ego for everyone else you perceive, which is equally variable. I look at you and I see one thing. Somebody else looks at you and they see something else. And you do the same thing. You look at different people and people judge other people just from their appearance. They have different understandings. One person looks at somebody and sees a dirty old man or woman walking the streets and homeless and saying, and judging them about, oh boy, they're probably alcoholic, this and that. Somebody else looks at that person and says, oh no, that's my father, that's my mother. How did they get into that condition? So everyone makes an ego for everyone else he perceives, which is equally variable. Their interaction is a process that alters both. Every interaction that your ego has with any other ego is an interaction, and it alters both of you because it alters your perceptions, because they are not made by or with the unalterable. If you looked at everybody as being the spirit, and that was your only judgment, was their spirit, then that would be that, and that would be not ego thinking, and that would be unalterable then. Your spirit, your spirit, your, that's the same thing as saying you and I are one. There's only one of us. We're all the child of God. It is important to realize that this alteration can and does occur as readily when the interaction takes place in the mind as when it involves physical proximity. So just thinking about someone is enough. You don't have to actually be in their physical presence. Thinking about another ego is as effective in changing relative perception as is physical interaction. So there could be no better example that the ego is only an idea and not a fact. When you analyze all of this and you realize it's all going on in your mind, you see somebody and you have a thought, a judging thought that puts them into a category that defines them and labels them, or you think about somebody, even if it's a historical person or just a group of people or whatever, your mind is labeling them, perceiving them one way or the other, judging them. So the ego is only an idea and not a fact. If it was a fact, we'd be in real trouble. So let's go on. Paragraph 3. Your own state of mind is a good example of how the ego was made. Well, think about that for a minute. When you threw knowledge away as if you had never had it, which is what we did when we created the ego and had that thought of separation, this is so apparent that one need only recognize it to see that it does happen. If this occurs in the present, why is it surprising that it occurred in the past? Surprise is a reasonable response to the unfamiliar, though hardly to something that occurs with such persistence. But do not forget that the mind need not work that way, even though it does work that way now. Well, it need not work that way because you can learn to think with your spirit mind instead of your ego mind. And when he says that it does not work that way now, he's talking to somebody who's only thinking with ego mind. So again, if you have progressed into starting to think with spirit mind, you can, modify that last part of that sentence. Think of the love of animals for their offspring and the need they feel to protect them. That is because they regard them as part of themselves. No one dismisses something he considers part of himself. You react to your ego much as God does to his creations, with love, protection, and charity. Your reactions to the self you made are not surprising. In fact, they resemble in many ways how you will one day react to your real creations, which are as timeless as you are. The question is not how you respond to the ego, but what you believe you are. Belief is an ego function, and as long as your origin is open to belief, you are regarding it from an ego viewpoint. When teaching is no longer necessary, you will merely know God. Belief that there is another way of perceiving is the loftiest idea of which ego thinking is capable. That is because it contains a hint of recognition that the ego is not the self with a capital S. Any thoughts or questions on those two paragraphs? Sentence 7, the question is not how you respond to the ego, but what you believe you are. If you believe that you are a mere schmear human being, oh, well, you are what you believe. But if you believe that you are a spiritual being, well, you are what you believe. But it says belief is a perception, and only of which ego is capable. The spirit doesn't have to believe because the spirit knows. So you can either believe that you're a human being, or you can know that you're a spiritual being. And so, as the old saying goes, we are spiritual beings living a human experience, or something to that effect. The important thing here is just coming to understand that there is that duality while we're in these human bodies, that we do have that ego mind and we do have that spirit mind, and we have to make the transition from the one to the other. Eileen?
Yeah, I was just thinking, it's so interesting, this sort of global concept that belief itself, just belief itself, is already not part of the spirit mind. That even belief that in a spirit mind is an ego construct, because belief itself, that's just so powerful to me, that the concept of belief itself is an ego construct. So
Yeah.
even believing in spirit is an ego construct.
Yes. And why?
It's pretty mind-blowing, actually, because spirit mind has no beliefs. It's just knowledge.
Right.
It's just knowing. So that's for me, that is such an interesting thing to incorporate. Even believing in spirit is an ego concept.
Yes. Thank you for that. That's a powerful insight from this reading.
Wow.
So ask me if I believe in God.
John,
Yes.
you believe in God?
No, I am God. I don't have to believe in God. I am God. So.
Wow, that's big. That's so big.
I've said that to people. They blows their mind. What do you mean? Oh, you think you're God? Okay, where are we?
And then they would say, that's so egotistical.
I know, yeah, really. Oh, how we love to play with words. We're on paragraph 7. The ego literally lives by comparisons. Yes, Lee?
I'm sorry, I think we're on 5.
Exactly, we are.
How did I get up to 7? Oh, thank you. Okay, 5. Undermining the ego's thought system must be perceived as painful, even though this is anything but true. Babies scream and rage if you take away a knife or scissors, although they may well harm themselves if you do not. In this sense, you are still a baby. You have no sense of real self-preservation and are likely to decide that you need precisely what would hurt you most. Yet whether or not you recognize it now, you have agreed to cooperate in the effort to become both harmless and helpful, attributes that must go together. Your attitudes, even toward this, are necessarily conflicted because all attitudes are ego-based. This will not last. Be patient a while and remember that the outcome is as certain as God. So, we're being told here that the outcome is as certain as God, and that God is a certainty, and that we need to be patient with ourselves. That we need to see ourselves as children, and we don't necessarily know what's best for ourselves and what could possibly be harmful to us. And although for many people, undermining the ego's thought system is perceived as painful, and that's how ego would have it, because again, it's trying to preserve itself. So if it makes you think that you're getting rid of it is painful, then it has a chance to keep you tied to it longer. But it will not be the end. Spirit looks back from the end of time. And we were just saying how time is an ego construct that doesn't really exist. So saying that spirit looks back from the end of time means the end of ego. And so that's the atonement, that's the resurrection, that's the enlightenment, and spirit looks upon us from that point of view and knows, which means it's certain that we will reach that point, that we will, each and every one of us, reach that point of undoing the ego completely and completely mending that tear of separation and healing that so that we are unified once again in our own minds with our Father, and thus the ego mind will be eliminated altogether. So be patient a while and remember that the outcome is as certain as God. Paragraph 6. Only those who have a real and lasting sense of abundance can be truly charitable. This is obvious when you consider what is involved. To the ego, to give anything implies that you will have to do without it. When you associate giving with sacrifice, you give only because you believe that you are somehow getting something better and can therefore do without the thing you give. Giving to get is an inescapable law of the ego, which always evaluates itself in relation to other egos. It is therefore continually preoccupied with the belief in scarcity that gave rise to it. Its whole perception of other egos as real is only an attempt to convince itself that it is real. Self-esteem in ego terms means nothing more than that the ego has deluded itself into accepting its reality and is therefore temporarily less predatory. This self-esteem is always vulnerable to stress, a term which refers to any perceived threat to the ego's existence. Anything, anybody?
I think that, the continual thread that I'm hearing is just about what's temporary, subject to change based on whatever, and what's true is never temporary. It's not altered, it's not variable. Nothing affects it. And so all of these ego constructs are always in flux.
Yes.
And that just, and it's almost like you can use it as a, like a benchmark or some sort of a measure. Is this changeable? Can this be, is this something that's subject to whatever's going on, or is it not? And if it's not, then it's real.
Okay. I get where you're coming from, but I don't know if I would say it in that way.
Because like this table is real, but it's not spirit.
Right.
I mean, I could get a hammer and change the table into a pile of rubble, I guess.
Yeah, but you don't, that's not going to change it from spirit to ego.
So what would you use as a measure?
Well, when you're talking about spirit, you're talking about unchangeable principles, love, peace, joy, wisdom, abundance, prosperity, true abundance, which he mentions here. Those concepts, eternal, everlasting. You can't apply physical things to this because everything that's physical is part of the ego.
So, but even those things you're mentioning, most of us come and go from that. I know love, I know peace, I know joy, but not 24/7.
Right, because if you knew them 24/7, you wouldn't even be sitting here because you wouldn't
Yeah.
be ego anymore.
Okay. Glimpses, I guess.
Yeah, that's the thing, we have two minds. We have ego mind and spirit mind. And that's our whole reason for studying this is try to work out of the one and into the other. They're both there. So eventually we'll do that as is promised. The outcome is as certain as God. But obviously we're sitting here in a Zoom chat room, so I don't think spirit needs Zoom.
We're not there yet.
We're not there yet.
Okay.
All
right.
It's baby steps. Baby steps. It's like, we're still on the journey.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
But we are getting closer.
We're certainly reading the right stuff.
So I want to go back to that. Only those who have a real and lasting sense of abundance can be truly charitable. In other words, a spiritual sense of abundance, a spiritual sense of knowing that everything that is eternal is of spirit. And if it's eternal, you can't lose it. You can't give it away. It can't be diminished. It can't run out. You can't run out of it. So a lasting sense of abundance can truly be charitable, because the truly charitable person will give and give and give and give and give, and never think a thought about it, because he knows that spirit is the source of inexhaustible supply, whereas ego, to give anything implies that you have to do without it, that you're sacrificing. Oh. And when you associate giving with sacrifice, you only give because you believe that you are somehow getting something better and can therefore do without the things you give. That's like cleaning out your closet to give your old stuff to the homeless people. Well, I can do without this. I'll just go out and buy myself some more. Yeah. That's not true charity. Sure, like Jesus said, to paraphrase, I have no idea, I can't quote it, but give them the shirt off of your back, give them everything you've got without, and don't think another thing about it, because spirit is the source and the substance of all of my supply. Jesus told the disciples, he said, "Go out and preach the good word and don't take anything with you. Don't worry about your needs. Look at the birds of the air and the flowers in the field. They have everything they need. God just gives them everything they need. They don't have to struggle and toil for anything." And he lived his life that way. He just went around doing his thing. He wasn't working a job. He didn't need money. He didn't even carry money. He knew that no matter where he is, no matter what, that, he'd have a place to stay. He'd have food to eat for his ego body that he was still walking around in. He knew that he would always be taken care of. And he taught his disciples to do that too. He said, you don't have to worry about any of that. If you just go out and live in spirit, everything will be provided for you, whatever your needs may be in the ego world. And that's true abundance. that understanding, that knowing, and living your life that way. Now we're on to paragraph 7. I finally got there, didn't I? Am I there yet? All right. The ego literally lives by comparisons. Equality is beyond its grasp, and charity becomes impossible. The ego never gives out of abundance because it was made as a substitute for it. Aha. That is why the concept of getting arose in the ego's thought system. Appetites are getting mechanisms, representing the ego's need to confirm itself. This is as true of bodily appetites as it is of the so-called higher ego needs. Body appetites are not physical in origin. The ego regards the body as its home and tries to satisfy itself through the body. But the idea that this is possible is a decision of the mind, which has become completely confused about what is really possible. Anything? Paragraph 8. The ego believes it is completely on its own, which is merely another way of describing how it thinks it originated. This is such a fearful state that it can only turn to other egos and try to unite with them in a feeble attempt at identification, or attack them in an equally feeble show of strength. It is not free, however, to open the premise to question, because the premise is its foundation. The ego is the mind's belief that it is completely on its own. The ego's careless, a ceaseless attempt to gain the spirit's acknowledgement and thus establish its own existence are useless. Spirit in its knowledge is unaware of the ego. It does not attack, it merely cannot conceive of it at all. While the ego is equally unaware of spirit, it does perceive itself as being rejected by something greater than itself. This is why self-esteem in ego terms must be delusional. The creations of God do not create myths, although creative effort can be turned to mythology. It can do so, however, only under one condition. What it makes is then no longer creative. Myths are entirely perceptual, and so ambiguous in form and characteristically good and evil in nature that the most benevolent of them is not without fearful connotations. So ego creates myths, but spirit knows only truth. Ego's afraid it's going to be attacked by something greater than itself and does its darndest to self-preserve. And spirit isn't even aware of ego, doesn't even know of ego. Because ego is just a dream, it's unreal, it doesn't really exist from spirit's point of view. Anyone?
How do relationships work in this context of the idea? Is the idea, is a relationship inherently simply an ego pursuit?
Well, it starts out that way.
Well, I'm just looking at this idea that it says this is such a fearful state that it can only turn to other egos and try to unite with them in a feeble attempt at identification. That made me wonder about relationships.
Mhm. Or attack them in an equally feeble show of strength.
Right. So that for me, that was easier because abstaining, shall we say, from attacking somebody, from being different or whatever, that doesn't feel challenging. But the idea that relationships are, kind of like that relationships themselves are, an ego-based pursuit and therefore not of spirit. I'm wondering about that because that's the part that connects to the other part of the sentence, which is to try to unite with other egos in a feeble attempt at identification. Is that speaking to, forming, I'm not talking about getting combative with, where it says attack, but in the other idea, which is where you're looking to unite, not attack. Is that making a statement about relationships as just, sort of a non-spirit thing?
I think I'm understanding what you're trying to say or how you're thinking. Relationships on an ego level, it's how you're thinking about the other person. It's not that you're not, that to have any relationships is ego. It's how you're thinking of them. If your relationship with somebody is full of perception, in other words, you perceive them as good or bad, handsome or ugly, rich or poor, feeble or strong. There's all kinds of opposite things here. Then that's all an ego. If you're in a relationship with somebody and you can, in your mind, no matter what they do, no matter what they say, if you can think of them as being a spiritual being equal to yourself, and that you can identify that when you look at that person, you're looking in a mirror, that you are seeing yourself because there's only one of us, then you're having a spiritual relationship. Anything less than that is an ego relationship. That's my thought about this. So the book.
So in that scenario, you're theoretically unaffected by what they do.
Yes, because you do not judge. There's no judgment involved. There's complete and total forgiveness. Remember, the object of our lessons here is the atonement, complete forgiveness. You are an immortal spirit, whole and innocent. All is forgiven and released. That's the only way to think of another person. Complete and total forgiveness, just seeing them as an immortal spirit, whole and innocent, and seeing yourself that way too. And the book teaches us that the more we can see other people in this way, the more we will see ourselves in this way. Because there is only one of us. So every time I can look at another person and say, you're an immortal spirit, whole and innocent, and all is forgiven, I'm actually saying that to myself.
And vice versa, I'm guessing.
Yes, if you can think of yourself that way, it's much easier to think of others that way.
Okay.
So, again, Jesus was an example of this. No matter who came up to him, they went to crucify him, and he just stood there and said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Whether it was the woman at the well, the money lender, the tax man, the blind person, the sick on the stretcher, the prostitute, he looked at everyone equally, or as we're told. He just extended love and forgiveness to everyone and didn't judge them. He said, you who are without sin, cast the first stone. Who are you to judge that woman? You're going to stone her because you think she's a bad person and it's your place to put her to death? Like you, by your own judgment, shouldn't be stoned yourself? I think we're on number 9, aren't we?
Yes, 9, yes.
Myths and magic are closely associated, since myths are usually related to ego origins and magic to the powers the ego ascribes to itself. Mythological systems generally include some account of the creation and associate this with its particular form of magic. The so-called battle for survival is only the ego's struggle to preserve itself and its interpretation of its own beginning. This beginning is usually associated with physical birth because it is hard to maintain that the ego existed before that point in time. The more religiously ego-orientated may believe that the soul existed before and will continue to exist after a temporary lapse into ego life. Some even believe that the soul will be punished for this lapse. However, salvation does not apply to spirit, which is not in danger and does not need to be salvaged. So we've gone into, we've taken a turn here into kind of a different topic in a way at the end of paragraph 8 with myths. The first time it's mentioned myths in sentence 12, or no, 10. The creations of God did not create myths, although creative effort can be turned to mythology. It can do so, however, only under one condition. What it makes is then no longer creative. Myths are entirely perceptual and so ambiguous in form and characteristically good and evil in nature that the most benevolent of them is not without fearful connotations. So, in effect, because he's talking about how the ego works, what the ego believes, how the ego is structured. And so that's how we get into this idea of myths. So myths and mythology is an ego construct, and it's a kind of a way for ego to explain the past, because for the most part, everybody believes that, they didn't exist before they were born. And he says later on there in paragraph 9 that, some of the more religious people, ego-orientated, believe that the soul did exist, but they didn't exist as a person. And then then there's a heaven, they can go to heaven or hell if they're going to be punished, But all of this is within the myth construct of ego, because the spiritual being knows that he is a spiritual being, always was a spiritual being, always will be a spiritual being, and there is no past, present, or future. There's just isness, and isn't concerned with the myth, with the mythology. The people who don't have that spiritual understanding and who are completely engaged in ego, well, they make much ado about myth and the struggle between good and evil and all of this. Do we have any discussion here?
Seems to be me over and over and over. I mean, I'm just thinking, when it comes to the topic of religion, there's a lot of food for discussion.
Yeah, all religion is ego for the most part.
Yeah, I guess that actually shrinks it down to one quick sentence, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, there are aspects of certain religions that are more spiritual than other, have a better spiritual understanding. And there's certainly individuals from all different religious traditions who have worked to overcome the ego and put themselves into a spiritual state. And there's some things like Buddhism, but Buddhists don't really consider the Buddhism as a religion. They consider it as a way of living, living by the precepts of Buddha and all. It's not a belief system. They're not standing up in church saying, I believe in the one God who's and saying the Mass and all of that, or reading the Bible and all. And so it's a different thing. But
yeah, I don't even think they have a space for the idea of spirit.
I'm not that, I mean, I know a little bit about everything.
Okay.
I was brought up a Catholic myself, so I'm fairly well versed in Catholicism. But and there have been mystic Catholics in the past, but yeah, in today's parlance, we would say spiritualists or as regard to I'm not a religious person, I'm a spiritualist person. I use that term, meaning that there's no creed involved. That's why I like the Quakers. The Quakers have no creed. So anyway, all righty. It's 8 o'clock. I'm going to end here at paragraph 9. So we'll pick up with paragraph 10 next week. So before we leave, then, is any last minute reflections to share on what we've read tonight? No, we're all good. Last call, Helene. Anything? No? Okay, well, that's good, I guess. All righty then, friends, let's have a moment of silence, please.